know he has been ambassador to more countries than I've ever dreamed of visiting, including Russia and Japan and Australia and Switzerland and Liechtenstein and about a lot of the former Soviet republics. So he's an extraordinarily experienced and effective civil servant, if you would.
I hope.
He was also very influential in putting together the talks that resulted in the Good Friday Treaty and the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in 1998. Having read the bio the other day, I just thought I'd go ahead and he, of course, he's here today, particularly as a close friend with Seamus Heaney, and I thought maybe I'd let Seamus Heaney speak of our guest. This is a poem that he wrote, Alumnus Illustrissimus, because they were at St. Column's together for school. From Washington to far Japan, they honor noble Sharkey song. To Muscovites, he is the Tsar, the vodka, and caviar. Ned Kelly to the crowd down under, to Danes, the Thor of strength and thunder. From Inishowen to Dublin 4, from Strasbourg to Sicily shore, his hospitality and gumption, his ability to judge and function, and hold his own in all encounters with poets, politicians, and hunters, is legendary. We're proud of him. He does us proud. Here's to you, Jim. From Seamus Heaney.
Well, thank you very much. But I thought just to write on the board when we begin some of the big dates in Heaney's life. And just 1939, he was born just as the war was breaking out in Europe. He was one of 9 kids. I don't know whether that's normal in America these days, but it was normal in Ireland in those days. And he was the first of his family to win a scholarship to a secondary school, which was very important for him. And there he learned all about Wordsworth, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Thomas Hardy. If you look at your book, 250 poems, you'll see that Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over hill and dale, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, nothing is as beautiful as spring that breaks through weeds and weeds, and so on. And Thomas Hardy, not as a poet but as a novelist, were all very important in his formation. Then again, he went on to do better things. He went to Queen's University in Belfast. He was part of a generation in Northern Ireland which benefited from reforms that were brought in by the government in Britain at the end of the Second World War, because normally Catholics wouldn't have got, poor Catholics anyway, in Northern Ireland, or poor nationalists, if you want to call them that, wouldn't have got a secondary or a third level education. Then he taught as a college teacher in Belfast. And then I go through some of those things with you, but I went to the same school as Seamus Heaney, and it was a fairly rough school, I have to say, very unlike the American high schools that we saw in the movies, where people were encouraged and prompted and so on, with sweets and caviar and such like. But I remember I was the first year when he was in his final year. He was the head prefect. And he was from the country, I was from the city. So fellas from the country were a lot bigger than fellas from the city. And then in my second year, and he was a great scholar, he worked very hard. He was committed because probably he loved studies. And he won, you know, he won a scholarship to university, but also he won what you might call the top scholarship. There were only 10 of them given in the whole of Northern Ireland, and it was called a state exhibition. And traditionally this college, St. Colum's College in Derry, St. Colum's High School, would won 2 or 3 of these very special exhibitions. And the tradition was for the guy or guys who won the exhibition to come back. And they would go up and ask the president of the college for a free day, you know, a day, let everybody else in the school off. So, of course, hoping for a free day, I'd done no homework for that day. And so I was banking on the president saying yes to the request for a free day. So we remember Heaney coming up the walks of the college and going up the stairs to the president's room, and he waited outside in great suspense, and then Heaney came out shaking his head. No, he wouldn't give it to me, boys, he wouldn't give it to me. And then we said, up again, Seamus, up again. So up again, and he knocked at the door, and the president said, come in. And he said, you know, it's traditional to give a free day when we won these state exhibitions. And the president said, no, the boys are too busy, can't have wasted in 3 days. Down the stairs, Heaney said no, he wouldn't give it to us. And then the third time, up again, Seamus, up again. And this time he got it. The president said, yes, okay, you can have the free day. And everybody cheered and carried him and all of this sort of thing. And what I heard afterwards, of course, which I didn't know at the time, was that the president of the college had a golf engagement on that day, so he was only too glad to give the free day in honour of Seamus Heaney. But Queen's University, I went to Dublin. I didn't go to Queen's University in Belfast. I went to University College in Dublin. And Seamus became a college teacher. He taught in high school, and then he taught in a training college for teachers, and then he taught at the university. And we heard rumours in Dublin that some of these Derry fellows, as we call them, were actually writing poems. Could you imagine it? I mean, here were fellows who played Gaelic football, the equivalent of American rules football, who were big, tough guys. And there we heard these rumours that they were writing poetry. And then the next thing that happened, the year I graduated, Seamus Heaney published a book of poems, Death of a Naturalist. And everybody wanted to be a poet after that. We couldn't wait to be a poet after that. But as you know, I think Professor Coakley has circulated some poems for you. I thought if you wanted to see Seamus Heaney's signature, I have it on 2 books here. The reason that a signature, well, he's a nice writer, but he used to sign books quite a lot. And he used to say, he said that my books are worth more unsigned than they are signed. So, so these are the signed books. This one is The Boys of St. Colum's, which is the story of a certain group of boys who went to this school, St. Colum's in Derry. And I'm lucky, I don't know why I'm included in it, but the others are actually important people. And this one is a book that Seamus gave to me. And I'm going to give this one to the college here. It's signed by John Hume, who's another Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner from Derry. So treated gently. But when I was at the college, it was always the thing, sometimes some boarders would be boarders, they were day boys, guys who went there from the city, and we were lucky we only had to go to the college from 9:10 in the morning until 3:30 in the evening. But these poor boarders had to stay there all the time. And sometimes when you were in the class, the boarder would be called out, a boarder, one of the guys who was boarding, and you know by the look of the teacher or the person knocking at the door that there was something strange. Once upon a time, Seamus Heaney was called out, and And I think it's one of the poems in your book of 250 poems, and it's about the death of his young brother, and it's called Midterm Break, and I think you have it there. I sat all morning in the college sick bay. If anything was wrong with you in St. Colum's, they brought you up to the sick bay. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells, nailing classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He'd always taken funerals in his stride, and big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked in the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my troubles. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse, stretched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box of his cot. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. And that clearly was one of the most dramatic moments in Heaney's life. He lived 35 miles from St. Colum's College, and it was a long, slow, sad journey by car to get there. And he grew up in the county of Derry. He grew up the son of concerned and educated at a certain level Catholics, but also they weren't very wealthy. His father traded cattle, and they had a farm, and his poetry is full of the spirit of rural life. He felt close to the earth. He felt close to the movement of the seasons. Near his farm there was a bog. I don't know if you have bogs in Pennsylvania. A bog is, Ireland is full of bogs, and it's sort of deposits of earth that have been left by the glaciers, decomposed moss and roots. And in Ireland, in the old days, we used to cut into it with a special spade and burn it. We burned it for fuel, and you can still do that in Ireland. And so that's how you would have had your evening meals. It would have been cooked over the fire in special pots on a turf fire. But when Seamus Heaney went to Queen's University in Belfast, he knew he was leaving all of that behind. And when he began to publish poetry, he knew that he was definitely moving away, if not in his imagination, at least in his development from all of that tradition. And I think all of you know the poem he wrote, which is the first poem in his first collection of poetry, Death of a Naturalist. And it's called Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging, I look down, till his straining rump among the floor beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. I don't know, has anybody ever dug with a spade in this one? Anybody else? 2, 3? You put it down and you use your knee to push it in further. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes where we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, that old man could handle a spade just like his old man. My grandfather could cut more turf in a day than any man in Tunner's Bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I had no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. Now, when Seamus Heaney published his first book of poems in 1966, on the face of it, Northern Ireland seemed to be sort of ordinary society. But underneath it all, there was something strange and uneasy, unstable about it all. Because the truth was that this Education Act, which gave people like Seamus Heaney and his generation the ability, on the basis of an examination, to go to secondary school and university, was changing the thing. In Northern Ireland, for historic reasons, nationalists, Catholics, who looked towards the south of Ireland as their natural homeland, not Britain, were second-class citizens. They were deprived of voting rights in houses and in employment. And so when that generation of Heaney and John Hume went to university and came out, began to teach, in those days, if you were a Catholic and you went through that system, you were either meant to be a teacher or a priest. So if you couldn't become a priest, you became a teacher. And everybody started off one way or another as a teacher. But it wasn't enough just to be a teacher to have a good job. You wanted the full rights of the society. And not only did you want them for yourself, you wanted them for other people in your community. If you were moving forward, you wanted to feel that your family and friends and so on were moving with you. And so there was a big challenge civil rights movement based on the American civil rights movement, a big movement for reform. And the problem was that the Unionist majority, those who looked towards England as their homeland and their special place of privilege and honour, they seemed incapable in their own of yielding these reforms. Just the weight of history on their shoulders as well. And they replied with, if you like, anger and repression to the demands for civil rights. And they made space for the re-emergence of an illegal organisation called the Irish Republican Army, which was committed to the violent overthrow of Northern Ireland and the link with Britain. On the Unionist side also there were violent groups and so on, and very fire and brimstone-like preachers. So those troubles in Northern Ireland, and I've given some of the dates over here, they form part of the backdrop of Seamus Heaney's poetry. And you know, in a way, in Belfast you couldn't go up the street in 1972 without being stopped by a policeman and asked who you were and where you were going and all of that sort of thing, and having your bag searched. And even if you were the most innocent person in the world, it happened. And in 1972 in our city, in the city of Derry in January, there was a big incident in which there was a civil rights movement march. The incident was called Bloody Sunday. And peaceful protesters ended up, and who gave the order we don't know, but they ended up in the firing line of very specialised British troops called paratroopers. And these paratroopers shot at the unarmed, innocent marchers, and 13 people were killed. And that was a big blow for everybody. And Seamus Heaney, in terms of his movement, his personal development, his natural Irishness, you might say, as well, he decided to move to Dublin with his family. And in fact, the third, you know, in your section on Seamus Heaney in your book, the third poem in your book, 250 poems, is a poem called The Glanmore Sonnet. And that's about Seamus having moved to this place called Glanmore in County Wicklow. A cottage, in fact, where a very famous Irish playwright once lived, a playwright called John Millington Synge. When Seamus moved out of Belfast, of course, there was a lot of mumbling and grumbling. People saying, oh, you've betrayed us, you've deserted us, you've taken refuge, you've gone off to the peace and contentment of Dublin. And so the move was not without tension. And it's reflected also in his poetry. But a very important development, apart from going to Dublin, as I say, the third poem in your book, Glanmore Sonnet, is inspired by his Wicklow experiences. But he began to travel to the United States as well. Inevitably, people in America spotted him as a talent, and he was invited many times. Eventually, he got the most prestigious literature professorship in Harvard in 1985. But I got to know Seamus again, if you like, in 1980, when he came to stay with us, and he often did when I lived in Washington. And he told me the story a bit about some of the background to his departure from Northern Ireland. And the emergence of the Troubles in Northern Ireland happened while people of Seamus's generation also were reaching out to engage people of the opposite community in dialogue, and there was a number of initiatives. And Seamus used to go with two other people. One was a poet from, if you like, although he wouldn't call himself that, the Unionist tradition, and another was a singer. And they would go around Northern Ireland reading together to encourage people to see each other as the one community. And in 1971, I think it was, Seamus and the singer were going into a recording studio in Belfast. It was the same studio where Van Morrison, if you ever heard of Van Morrison, where he had made some of his early recordings. And they were about to record a record, an LP, which it was in those days, an LP, a long-playing record. And when suddenly there were bombs going off outside, and that they heard that the IRA had put a bomb in a shop, and that a number of people had been injured. So the two of them were very upset by all of that. And the singer began to strum. He was a very good guitarist, strum his guitar, but he couldn't bring it out of himself with all of the stuff that was happening around him to take part in the LP. And Seamus agreed, and they didn't do it. And some years later, Seamus wrote a poem which is called The Singer's House. And it has two parts, and it deals with the way you think of words, of names of places. Carrickfergus is a town, a very beautiful town in the north of Ireland, where, let's put it this way, that in those days Catholics might not have been too welcome. And it's also a place which has surprisingly a huge salt mine. So when you salt the roads in the winter, the salt often comes from Carrickfergus. So that sort of negative historic context is in the first part of Seamus's poem. And so the note of the word Carrickfergus is no longer warm for him. But the next note is in a place in the south of Ireland. Actually, it's in the county Donegal, which is the most northerly part of Ireland, but it's in the political south. And the place is Gibara, a beautiful place in West Donegal, a big river estuary, and a huge sandbar, and seals sitting out in the rocks. And Irish people in the very, very old days used to believe that you shouldn't attack a seal, you shouldn't kill a seal, because a seal is a human being wearing a seal skin. And if you could capture the seal skin, you could marry a beautiful woman, because underneath the seal skin was a beautiful woman. Anyway, the singer's house. When they said Carrickfergus, I could hear the frosty echo of salt miners' picks. I imagined it, chambered and glinting, a township built of light. What do we say anymore to conjure the salt of their earth? So much comes and is gone that should be crystal and kept. And amicable weathers that bring up the grain of things, their time of season and store, are all the packing we get. So I say to myself, Guibara, and its music hits off the place like water hitting off granite. I see the glittering sun framed in your window, knives and forks set on the oilcloth, and the seal's head suddenly outlined, scanning everything. People here used to believe that drowned souls lived in the seals. At spring tides they might change shape. They loved music and swam in for a singer who might stand at the end of summer in the mouth of a whitewashed turf shed, his whole shoulder to the jam, his song a rowboat far out in the evening. When I came here first, you were always singing, a hint of the clip of the pick in your winnowing climb and attack. Raise it again, man, we still believe what we hear. So the guy, that poem is dedicated to a fellow called David Hammond, who was the singer in the studio, who owned a house in Gibara, where everybody felt relaxed, away from all of the troubles, and surrounded by the beauty and also the mythology of ancient Ireland. Now, after I went to America, I came back to Ireland, and then I went to Australia and Japan. I tried to get Seamus to visit me in Australia, but he wouldn't do it. I don't know whether it was too far away or he had some hang-up. He went to Australia afterwards, but he didn't. I know the reasons, but I won't share them with you if you don't mind. But he came to Japan on several occasions. So he loved Japan. He loved. Has anybody ever been to Japan here? Anybody like to go to Japan? Yeah, it's Japan is a strange place. It's an ultra-modern civilization in a certain way. When you travel to Japan, you think you're traveling several years into the future. Well, if you travel to New York, I would say, I suppose you get that sense as well of moving into the future. And the Japanese seem to be highly westernized. They've taken a particular fashion from the United States, the fashion of Grease in the 1950s, and James Dean and Natalie Wood, and they've turned it into an art form, and it's now the big fashion style of Asia by and large. But underneath, I used to say, every Japanese girl still wears a kimono. And the Japanese, and even in a big city like Tokyo, you're never far from touching something very ancient and something deeply rooted in the past of Japan. And I think Heaney enjoyed that contradiction in modern Japan between its ultra-modernity and between its preservation and sensitivity to its old, profound civilization. I also celebrated with Heaney his publication of Beowulf. Beowulf is, well, our language, I suppose, is English. Again, you should remember about Heaney that he's an Irishman. And, of course, the common language of Ireland today is English. Irish people at least try to speak English. I don't know if I speak English in the same way as you Americans, or if I speak English as well as you Americans, but we all, or they used to say, we're divided by the same language. But 200 years ago, about 80% of people living in Ireland spoke another language completely different from English. Absolutely different. As different as German is from Russian, or Italian is from Polish. And the way people think, and the way they talk, and their points of reference, and their heroes and anti-heroes are often grounded in the linguistic memory. So something happened to the Irish, they gave up the language. And there was a very famous Irish writer called James Joyce who died in Switzerland. I don't know if anyone here has heard of James Joyce. He's a very famous writer. He's supposed to have changed the modern novel, modern literature, if you like, almost completely. Anyway, he died in Switzerland, and it was a British ambassador, believe it or not, who was at his graveside. For some reason, the Irish ambassador wasn't there. And the British ambassador made a statement which I thought was very eloquent. He said, the Irish lost their language, but gave the world instead a new literature. And I think it's true in many ways. But those echoes of the old language and of the old mythology, like the ghosts inhabiting the bodies of seals, all of that mythology, belief in fairies, is still somewhere buried in the hearts of Irish people. Even if the Leprechauns all emigrated to America, we have still probably some fairies left in Ireland. But Heaney was able to reach and embrace all of that Celtic tradition. Sometimes we call it a Celtic tradition, Gaelic Celtic. But he was also a very fine scholar in the linguistic tradition of the language which we all now speak. And the great epic poem, what would you say the great epic poem of America is? Is there an epic poem in America, in American literature? What would you say it is? Did anybody, let's say, attempt to write a great American epic poem?
Leaves of Grass.
What?
Leaves of Grass.
Leaves of Grass. And what about Hiawatha? You wouldn't an attempt. But that's a modern expression of a very antique literary drive. And the great Anglo-Saxon, we speak a version, a modern version of Anglo-Saxon, greatly influenced by many other languages. The great epic poem of Anglo-Saxon, of the English, if you like, is Beowulf. It's also a poem which curiously is set in Denmark. And I wonder why a poem that is the English epic poem might be set in Denmark. Well, the reason is because the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes came from a common area which is now close to what is modern Denmark and Friesland and all along the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. And the old capital of Denmark, Viking Denmark you might say, Denmark is a country of Vikings, but the old Viking capital of Denmark is a place called Roskilde. And I took Seamus Heaney there. And I also, outside of Roskilde, there's an even older archaeological site where it's believed that some of the events told in the story of Beowulf happened. And so Seamus Heaney went to this space outside of Roskilde in Denmark, and he stood on the ground. It's a field with a little surrounding pattern, which is all that remains of the Great Hall. And he read from Beowulf. He read from his translation, which I think was the best-selling book of poetry of the 20th century. And as he was reading it, here he was, the gods of Thor and thunder, but there was a huge cloud formation in the sky. It was quite amazing. And suddenly, while he was reading, the power of the poet as a man of mystical strength, or as a woman of mystical strength, tapping into all of those energies which you as health specialists will know about, these energies inside the body that we know so little about. As he was reading and tapping into all of those energies, suddenly the cloud shifted and a great shaft of light came down on all of us who were reading at that poem with Seamus Heaney. Now, Seamus Heaney had been going to Denmark for many years, because one of the important things in his formation as a poet was that he discovered a book of photographs of bog bodies. Does anyone know what a bog body is? I don't know if you have them in America, but in Denmark, like in Ireland, there are lots of bogs. And in Scotland, there are lots of bogs. And in the Netherlands, there are lots of bogs. And people dig up, while they're cutting turf or doing something, they find almost the very well-preserved body of somebody, a man or a woman, and the skin, the peat, the acidy peat of the bog has sort of preserved the body. It's squeezed a bit like a book is squeezed, but you can see the faces and the forms. And I think you have a poem there which I won't read you, but which you should take home and read tonight before you go to bed, and it's called The Tolerant Man, and it's about Seamus Heaney's encounter with this bog body in Denmark. Now, these people in the bogs were frequently sacrificed. The reason they're found at such a depth and in such a place is because they belong to ancient Indo-European tribes before the Gaels or before the Celts, going back to what we call the Bronze Age, that is 1500 years before Christ. And for some reason these people were sacrificed, and it was often the same form of sacrifice. Their neck was cut or tightened, and their body was then thrown into a pit in the bog and buried. And it was a sacrifice of appeasement to the gods of the bog, so that they would look well on the tribe for the next season. Now, Seamus Heaney was influenced by Denmark and by the Vikings and by Old English poetry. And if you look at his poems, you'll find that he was one of the first poets in Ireland. We regarded the Vikings as terrible warriors, coming in, chopping our heads off and stealing our woman. But he was the first poet to reflect a much more up-to-date view of the Vikings, to give them credit where, not everywhere, but where credit was due. He had a sense of the whole of the North. I don't know whether Pennsylvania regards itself as part of the North. Do you find yourself close to Canada and the Arctic? And do you look north or do you look south? In any event, Heaney again, in an effort to find reconciliation, the notion of the north of Ireland, and that part of Ireland linked to Scotland, linked to the North Sea, linked to the North Atlantic, linked to the Vikings as well as the Gaels. He introduced all of those reconciling themes into his poetry because he wanted to embrace a notion of the North that was different from all of the tension and pain and sectarianism and bigotry and violence of the actual physical North of Ireland. But in the North of Ireland, as I say, there was violence on all sides, including by the authorities, including by the British, including by the IRA and by Protestant extremists. It was endemic at one stage. But one thing, the IRA ruled, if you lived in a poor community in a Catholic area, the IRA were probably a very strong force in that community. And they wouldn't allow girls to go with British soldiers. You'd have a young British soldier on patrol and a young girl from the neighbourhood, and they might talk to each other and so on. But at the start of the whole thing, the girls and the boys, the soldiers went out together. But the IRA put down a very hard rule because they were afraid that the soldiers would get information from these girls. And the IRA were very cruel. And they set the example of some girls in a terrible way. In their own city, they tied them to a lamppost, a bit like, I don't know if any of you know about collaboration in France after the Second World War, but collaborators with the Nazis had their hair cut and they were tarred. And in Derry, in my own town, the poor girls who were going with the British soldiers, at least 2 of them, were caught tied to a lamppost, and their hair was cut to shame them, and tar was poured on their head. A fearful, frightful, terrible thing. And Seamus Heaney writes a poem in which he draws together the notion of these men and women who were sacrificed to the gods of the bog. These Danish bog bodies or Irish bog bodies where you found the noose around their neck or you found their neck cut. And he draws a comparison between one of the beautiful female bodies that was found in Denmark and the poor girl who was tied to the lamppost in Derry. And I just, if you look at your, you have one, it's called Punishment. I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck, the wind on her naked front. It blows her nipples to amber beads. It shakes the frail rigging of her ribs. I can see her drawn body in the bog, the weighing stone, the floating rods and boughs, under which at first she was a bark sapling that is dug up, oak bone, brain firkin, her shaved head like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring to store the memories of love. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tarred black face was beautiful, my poor scapegoat. He's moved there almost invisibly to talk about the poor girl tied to the lamppost. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tarred black face was beautiful, my poor scapegoat. I almost loved you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur of your brains exposed and darkened combs, your muscles webbing and all your numbered bones. I who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, called and tarred, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal intimate revenge. big thing for Heaney is how do we relate to conscience? How do we relate to doing good? Are we able to do good? Can we stand up? How do we stand up and make a protest? It's very difficult. And Heaney carries this sense of guilt all the time. And it's very ennobling in his poetry because it's so universal. That maybe none of us ever do enough. And there he sees himself standing beside this poor girl at the lamppost. And instead of screaming and raging, there he is looking and watching and throwing, as he says, the stones of silence. How are we off for time?
Well, is anybody, I mean, there's no class in here afterwards. If anybody needs to go to another class, we're at 2:50 now, which is when the class ends.
Well, I mentioned Heaney's view of Ireland wasn't all bleak. I mean, I think that the poem The Singer's House contrasts two different moods about Ireland. The mood maybe that is induced in the north in those days, and the mood of the freedom when you cross the border and get into the wilds of the Irish mountains and forests and so on. And in that crossing, you also can touch all of the mythology of Ireland. You suddenly belong to an older world, not unlike Japan in some senses. I wouldn't say that the Irish are as good as the Japanese in holding on to their heritage, but nonetheless, it's sort of there. It's in the place names, the Gaelic place names, it's in the legends, it's around you in a way. And Seamus, I think your professor last year visited Ireland, and he visited Dublin, and he stayed in the Mercy House in Bagot Street, not very far from where I live. But he stole away from the nuns while he was there, and he went to a beautiful part of County Wicklow. Now, County Wicklow was one of the places that Seamus Heaney had his house. He had a house on the Strand in Dublin where you could look at the sea, and he had a house, a small cottage, the one I mentioned, owned by the famous playwright John Mullington Synge. And he would go up there. And in Wicklow, you have one of the great remnants of a glorious age of Irish civilization. And here everybody listening to me, their eyes glaze over and they get bored immediately. But you have to go back to the year 800 or 900, when all of these paddies whom you know today actually played an important role, because we brought Christianity into Ireland and turned it into something special. In the way if you rub a shell, you get a pearl effect. We turned it into something special because we mixed it with our own traditions. And we were able to bring the spirit of Ireland to Europe and to England and Scotland and so on. And we had many saints. As you know, the Irish are a very holy people. I mean, we're naturally holy, as you well know, I'm sure. But in those days we were called the land of saints and scholars. And one of these great saints lived in a place to where your professor stole away, Glendalough. It's a monastic city, because the Irish didn't like towns as you understand them. Even Cresson would have been a big town for the Irish 200 or 300 years ago. We preferred the countryside, and insofar as we had cities, they were monastic cities. So in Glendalough, there's a monastic city associated with a great saint called St. Kevin. Is there anybody in this room who has a relative called Kevin? Does anybody know anybody in America called Kevin? Who do you know? You don't know anybody called Kevin?
Oh, I do.
What's his name?
You mean the last name?
Yeah.
I don't know his last name.
But his first name is Kevin.
Yeah.
And you know somebody called Kevin as well? Kevin Costner, of course, Kevin Klein. But Kevin is a very old Gaelic name, and it's after this saint. And the saint was a bit of a rogue, because Irish saints weren't just holy men, but they were also rogues. and this saint didn't like women. And so there's a song about the saint. In Glendalough lived an old saint, renowned for his learning and piety. His manners were curious and quaint, and he looked upon girls with disparity.
Thank you.
And it's about him throwing this girl into the water to drown him because she was coming along with all her finery and beauty to tempt him away from his solitude. But the saint also, you know, like St. Francis, I'm sure you've heard of St. Francis. St. Francis was able to tame the wolf, and he was able to speak to the birds, and saints have that ability again. It's that primeval energy inside human beings that allows us to communicate with nature. So you have a poem there called St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And this is not about St. Kevin the rogue, this is about St. Kevin the good guy. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, his arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is narrow, so one turned out pan is at the window, stiff as a cross beam. When a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. So Kevin has his hand out the window because his cell is small, and suddenly a blackbird lands in his hand and lays an egg in the middle of his hand. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life. He's moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and the rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. So there he is, he's stuck. He can't move his hand because if he moves his hand, the poor egg won't hatch. So he does it, and that's a famous story about St. Kevin. But Heaney says, and since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful? Or in agony all the time, from the neck on out down through his hurting forearm? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of underneath crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labour and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten board, and on the riverbank forgotten the river's name. So at the poem, Heaney makes obeisance, he nods his head towards the saint, not as the rogue or not even as the lover of nature, but as the mystic, the man who is capable of meditation and of leaving himself, leaving his own being and being part of something more eternal. There's one last poem. I read it because it's one of my own favourites, and because Heaney died what year is this? Last August, on the 30th of August. I'd seen him shortly before he died, and we didn't expect him to die. He had had a stroke about 10 years ago, and he had recovered well from the stroke, but he was very frail, very weak. And I called him to see him, and we spoke about literature, and he was preparing to give a big lecture in New York, and it was going to be something special, this lecture. And I don't know whether there are notes for this lecture, maybe he even has a draft of it. And I told him I was coming to Pennsylvania, and I'd be giving a lecture here on citizenship and the 21st century. And I said I didn't know what to say to these students at all. And he said, don't worry, he said, when you have to give a lecture, the words eventually come. And he said some of his best lectures were written under pressure on a train in the final hour before arriving at his destination. Anyway, so as a postscript to Seamus Heaney and as a postscript to this class, there's a poem called Postscript, which I think you have in your collection. And it really is a very beautiful poem. Sometime take the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October when the wind and the light are working off each other so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones the surface of a slate grey lake is lit by the earth lightning of a flock of swans. Their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. As big, soft buffetings come with the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. I don't know, has anybody ever been to County Clare? But maybe you know going for a drive here because there's a fair bit of wind up in Cresson in Pennsylvania. And you parked your car and suddenly a big blast of wind and it shakes it all together. And those big blasts of wind come in off the Atlantic. And as Heaney says, they catch you by surprise. They come at the car sideways, they catch your heart off guard and they blow it open. I think that's one of the most beautiful of all of Heaney's poems, and I want to thank you for having me today and listening to me. Do you have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So did you pretty much know Seamus like our whole lives?
What?
Did you know Seamus like his whole life, basically?
Well, as I say, he was 6 years older than me. But I've known him, yeah, I mean, I've known him since I was 11, in a way. I got to know him really well, I suppose. I mean, he was like a godlike figure at certain times in my life. But when I was in Washington, once upon a time, I worked in the Irish Embassy in Washington in 1980, from 1980 to 85. And Seamus was already going up to Harvard in those days. And he used to come down. Well, there was always plenty to do, Georgetown, and you know, there's a lot of universities around, and he was invited to give talks and so on. But he would stay with us, and that's when I got to know him. And his wife, Mary. He's married to a girl also from north of Ireland who he met at university. She was trained to be a physical education teacher. And they married, they have 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. I suppose the family's all grown up now, they're in their 40s. Yeah, I got to know him. I wouldn't say I was, I wouldn't say I was one of his best friends, but I knew him very, very well.
Was his poetry influenced at all? I mean, he stayed at Harvard for quite a while. Did that, I mean, most of his poetry that I read is so intimately tied to his experience in Ireland and growing up. Is there a collection that really departs from that?
Yeah, this book here, Open Ground, is the ones he selected himself. It's not the complete works of Heaney. Heaney exists as a creative artist at 3 levels. One is as the poet whom all of us encounter. Second is as a playwright and translator. And he's adapted plays from Greece and from Gaelic and Beowulf from Anglo-Saxon. And as a critic, and he was regarded as one of the great critics of modern English literature. Every word that he uses, if you read his criticism, almost every word he uses in his voice. You can feel it, you can touch it. He had this incredible ability. He didn't talk in an abstract way like I do, but every sentence came out as a, you could see it, you could nearly see the thing he was describing. It came out in not colourful words, it came out in words that you could touch. Whatever way, whatever ability, extraordinary ability he had to choose words. No poet can escape from his own background. And no poet would want to escape from his own or her own background. I shouldn't say his, because some of the great poets are women. Some of the great American poets, Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, all extraordinary poets. And in the last meeting that I had with Heaney, it was clear that Elizabeth Bishop was going to figure quite prominently in whatever he was going to say in his lecture in New York. He met, Harvard was important, that Boston environment was important. It was a very scholarly and comfortable environment. You could have a drink in a Boston pub, and at the same time you could go out with somebody like Derek Walcott. He's in your book of 250 poems. He's another Nobel Prize winner. Or Joseph Brodsky. And Heaney was close to both of them. And in all of their poems, their background is luminescent in their poetry and is inspiring in their poetry. And why should it be otherwise? But of course, Heaney ranges much further. The poems are about Ireland, but not always about Ireland, and certainly not always about Northern Ireland. Any other questions? Yeah, good.
So more political and literary. What Catholics in Northern Ireland now do? They still want to be part of Ireland, or are they just like kind of sick?
Well, see, it's a question of identity, and the big agreement. I think you can see it up here. Can you see that? In 1997, the IRA ceasefire. 1997 to 2003, the peace process. The problem with the United Ireland is that the more you talk about a United Ireland, the more you say, I want the United Ireland, the more the unionist people get scared or more hardline or nervous, whatever way you want to describe it. And the more they talk about making us British, the more we would resent making British. So this peace process in Northern Ireland was a big compromise at the heart of it. It wasn't a conflict between Catholics as Catholics and Protestants as Protestants. It was a conflict of identity. People who felt they had a British identity and people who felt they had an Irish identity. It's just that those people, by and large, who thought they had a British identity came from the Protestant tradition, and those people who thought they had an Irish identity came from the Irish tradition. So at the essence of this agreement, this peace process, there's two things. One is to respect the identities of the two communities. And the second thing is to share government together. So you have a government in Belfast, which is not anymore what you might call a majority-only government. That's what was wrong in Northern Ireland. So everybody has a chance to have a minister in the government. And the third thing is, between North and South, there is a council. So there's lots of cooperation between ministers between North and South. And obviously, nationalists from the North of Ireland would hope that someday the border would fade away, and they hope naturally as well that changes in England, Scotland may become independent, and the British don't really care so much today anymore whether there's a united Ireland. So it's all the job of persuading the unionist community to feel relaxed. And maybe some new Ireland will, maybe not quite a united Ireland, or maybe the capital of Ireland will be in Belfast, or, you know, something strange and new maybe in 10 years' time. Good. Anything else? Don't feel shy.
I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's like your favorite country that you've been to?
You're not allowed to answer that question if you're a diplomat. Or you have to say apart from the United States. No, but you know, it used to be that diplomats couldn't, you know, make choices and show preferences and so on. There was an Irish playwright whose name was Brendan Behan, and he said that the job of a diplomat was somebody who was trained to sit on the fence with his ear to the ground. Sit on the fence with his ear to the ground. And, different, you know, when you're a diplomat and an ambassador, different countries hit you at different stages of your life, so they mean different things. Japan was an extraordinary place in many ways, but it wasn't necessarily the best place to have kids for complicated reasons. And Australia was perfect for kids. You could live outside in a tent all the time, all day if you wanted. Washington was the same, but I was so busy in Washington that my wife never saw me, so it was lucky I never got divorced. But so to Scandinavia, from the point of view of very fair societies, certainly the most impressive. But there was a lot of rules and regulations in Denmark as well. And if you burned the leaves in your garden on the wrong day, your neighbour might call for the police, and they would come knocking on your door and give you a fine and so on, because you had to be good in society as well as being a good person. But it varied. Anybody been to Ireland apart from your professor? Anybody would like to go to Ireland? Well, if I had the money, I would pay your rent. By the way, if you look at airfares, you know, you can buy cheap tickets, maybe not from Philadelphia, but you can buy cheap tickets from New York to Dublin. And so once you get to Ireland, you don't have to eat or anything. I mean, you know, the Irish are so generous, they will give you all the food you want. But it's not as dear as it used to be anymore. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.